The ceiling came down without warning. 1 second I was standing in a carved stone corridor that smelled like wet earth and something sweet and chemical. The kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat. The next second the floor shook like something deep underground had finally lost its patience, and the sound was not a crack or a boom. It was a groan, long and low and final, like a building deciding to give up. I had been on Velcathos for 11 days. My name is Marcus Hale. I am a xenobiological survey technician, which is a long way of saying I catalog alien plant life, take soil samples, and write reports that 7 people read, and 3 of those people are required to. I am not a soldier. I am not a diplomat. I carry a sample kit, a translation device that clips behind my ear, and a personal locator beacon that my supervisor, a sharpied woman named Claire Dawson, made me promise to activate the moment anything felt wrong. Nothing felt wrong. Right up until the moment everything was. The diplomatic observation team I was embedded with had been granted access to a Veli nursery tunnel for a supervised tour. Our escort was a group of 6 warrior caste Velkai, each of them roughly 2 m tall, 6-limbed, with carapaces the color of dark amber and eyes that caught light the way mirrors do, flat, bright, and carrying no expression a human face could read. They moved without sound. Every step was deliberate. They did not look at us so much as they processed us the way security system processes an unfamiliar visitor, neutral, watchful, waiting. The nursery tunnel itself was something I had no framework to prepare for. The walls were smooth and warm to the touch, shaped by the Veli over generations into gentle curves that carried soft bioluminescence in blue and pale gold. The air was thicker in there, humid and warm, and every few meters the walls gave way to wide, shallow alloves where the larvae rested. The Velkai called them broodlings. They were small, each one about the size of a human forearm, pale and soft compared to the armored adults, and they moved slowly, curling and uncurling in their alloves with a kind of lazy contentment that felt oddly peaceful given everything else about the species. Our mission briefing had described the Velkai in 3 words, repeated more often than any others: hierarchical, territorial, and unpredictable. The briefing had also said in a line that stuck with me because of how casually it was delivered that the Velkai had never recorded contact history, formed a voluntary extended bond with any individual member of another species. They worked with allies, they tolerated observers, they negotiated with ambassadors, but they did not bond. The structure of their society was built on biology, on chemical signals and caste roles, and a queen whose word was not lost so much as it was gravity, constant, invisible, and impossible to argue with. I had been told to observe, to document, and above all not to touch anything. I had been doing fine on all 3 counts, right up until the floor moved. The tremor lasted maybe 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the escort warriors reacted instantly and without hesitation. They moved outward to structural positions along the tunnel, walls bracing their postures, shifting from escort formation to something that looked like practiced emergency response. It was clearly a protocol they had trained for. Their bodies knew exactly what to do. The broodlings in the nearest alloves did not know what to do. They spilled forward as the alco lips cracked and tilted. tumbling into the main corridor in a soft, confused heap, and above them a section of the ceiling about 2 meters, wide and thick as a man's torso tore free with that same long groan and began to fall. I do not remember making a decision. I want to be honest about that, because I have thought about it many times since, and I cannot find the moment where I thought things through and chose a course of action. There was no calculation. There was no brave internal speech. There was just the ceiling falling and the small pale creatures as below it, and then I was already moving. And then I was on top of them, and then the ceiling landed on me. The weight drove the air out of my lungs completely. I felt the impact across my upper back and both shoulders like a single concentrated blow from something impossibly heavy, and for a second I could not think or breathe or do anything except exist in the space between one heartbeat and the next, flattened against the warm tunnel floor, with my arms wrapped around a pile of broodlings who were making sounds my translator could not decode, high-end, rapid, somewhere between a vibration and a cry. I did not know it then, but I was learning later that those sounds were not fear. They were something closer to confusion. The broodlings had no prior reference for a soft, fleshy creature from another planet throwing itself on top of them. Nothing in their biology had prepared them for that either. When the dust settled and the shaking stopped, I lifted my head and took stock. My back hurt in a way that felt serious. My left shoulder was screaming. I was bleeding from a cut somewhere above my eyebrow that I could feel but not see. The broodlings beneath me were unharmed. I could feel them moving, pressing against my chest and arms with a slow investigative curiosity, their small antenna touching my skin in what felt like questions. I became aware slowly that the tunnel had gone completely silent. I raised my eyes. Every warrior in the corridor had turned to face me, 6 of them motionless, their amber carapaces catching the bioluminescent light and cold, even planes. Their wings, usually folded tight against their backs, were half open, which my briefing notes had said was a posture associated with extreme alertness. Their compound eyes reflected me back at myself, small and dusty and bleeding on the floor. None of them moved. None of them made a sound. Then, from deep in the tunnel walls, not from any of the warriors, but from the stone itself, from some resonance that the tunnel carried like a river carries water, came a sound so low I felt it in my ribs before I heard it with my ears. Long, slow, rising and then leveling out like a tone being held. Might's translator made a sound it made when it encountered something outside its operational parameters, a soft chime. And then nothing, no output. One by one, starting from the warrior closest to the tunnel's far end and moving forward like a wave, all 6 of the escort warriors lowered themselves to the ground, not to a defensive crouch, not to a combat position. They went down on all 4 lower limbs, their upper arms extended flat to either side, their heads bowed until their mandibles nearly touched the floor. It was unmistakably a bow. I lay there on the floor of an alien tunnel, bleeding with 6 broodlings pressed against my chest, and tried to understand what had just happened. My back felt like it had been used as a landing pad. My shoulder was going to need medical attention. The ceiling section that had hit me was still balanced partially across my legs, which was either very lucky or very unlucky, depending on how you looked at it. None of that was the part I couldn't Understand, the part I couldn't understand was this: the six most dangerous living things I had ever stood in a room with had just put their faces on the floor. For me, my translator chimed again. This time it produced a single line of output, halting and incomplete, the way translations sound when the device is working with fragmentary data and doing its best. What it gave me was 4 words. The words were void, stupid, right, valid. Queen, I did not know what that meant. Yet, I would find out very soon, and once I did, I would understand that my life, the ordinary soil sample collecting, report writing life I had arrived on too, live was over. Something else had begun. And it had begun the moment I stopped thinking and started moving, and it was not going to end on any schedule I had any say in. I pushed myself up to sitting, moving carefully around the broodlings. One of them climbed onto my knee and sat there, antennae tapping against my arm with patient rhythmic curiosity. Okay, I said to no one and everyone. Okay. The warriors remained bowed. The resonance in the walls continued its slow, deep tone. Somewhere far down in the tunnel, in a direction I had not yet walked, something ancient and immense had heard what I did, and it had decided it needed to see me for itself. I was not escorted to the Queen's chamber so much as I was accompanied there by a silence so completed at wait. The 6 warriors moved around me in a loose formation, not the clipped efficient box they had used during the tour, but something slower and more deliberate, as though each of them was boys being careful about where they placed their feet. I still had blood drawing on my face. My translator had been patched through to a secondary analysis mode and was making quiet rhythmic sounds as it tried to process the acoustic signals it had captured in the tunnel. My survey team was not with me. I had caught a glimpse of Claire before the warriors closed ranks, her face white, her hand reaching for the emergency comm on her belt. She was not stopped from using it. Whatever was happening, the Velkai did not consider my colleagues a factor that was in its own way more unsettling than anything else. The tunnel that led to the Queen's chamber was different from the nursery passages. It was older. The walls were not smooth here. They were carved with patterns that ran in long, unbroken lines from floor to ceiling. And the patterns were not decorative. My brief training in Velkai visual language told me they were records, history, pressed into stone, thousands of years of it, layer on layer, each generation adding to what the one before had left. I walked through it slowly because the warriors walked slowly, and I let my eyes move across the carvings without pretending to understand them. There were shapes that might have been battles, shapes that were clearly hatching cycles, the elliptical forms of eggs in organized rows, shapes that repeated in clusters and might have been names or titles or prayers. I had no way to know. Near the chamber entrance, I stopped because the warrior at my left stopped, and when I looked at the carving directly beside me, I found something that did not look like the others. It was isolated in a section of wall that had been left otherwise bare, as though the space had been held open for it deliberately. The carving showed a figure upright, bilateral, smaller than the veli form surrounding it, with its arms extended downward over a cluster of small oval shapes, a human shape covering. Young, I stood in front of that carving for a long time, long enough that the warrior at my left made a low sound my translator rendered as something Approximating patience, I moved again. The chamber itself was vast. I had read descriptions of it in the mission brief. Reading them had not helped. The ceiling was so high it was lost in shadow, and the space was lit by bioluminescent growth along the walls and floor that pulsed slowly in and out like breathing. The smell was different here, deeper, older, something that moved through the translator's olfactory sensors and came back flagged as complex and outside standard catalog parameters. There were other villi in the chamber, more than I could count, arranged in concentric rings that gave the center of the room a wide open space. They were all still watching at the center of the room on a dais that was not elevated so much as it was set apart, defined by the careful emptiness around it. Was the Queen. No briefing document had prepared me for her either. She was large in the way that geological formations are large, not threatening in any active sense, but simply occupying space in a way that changed the space around her. Her carapace was a deep dark amber that was almost black in the chamber's low light, and it was not smooth like the warriors. It had texture, layer on layer of growth accumulated over centuries, and it carried a faint luminescence of its own that pulsed at a different rhythm than the walls. Her eyes, 6 of them arranged in 2 rows, caught the light from every direction at once, and when they moved to me, which they did, the moment I entered the chamber, I felt it as a physical thing, not threatening, not aggressive, absolute. Between her and me stood a single veli unlike any I had encountered in 11 days on Velcathos. This one was smaller than the warriors, with a carapace that had been carefully marked in pale pigments in patterns that my translator flagged as indicating castrol, where the warriors were built for force and the broodlings were soft with youth. This Velki had a quality of stillness that felt less like patience and more like precision. Controlled, calibrated. The translator identified the caste marking instantly, because it was one of the few it had been specifically programmed for before the mission. Interpreter caste high tier. I used that pronoun because the translator applied it to interpreter. Caste Velkai by convention was already looking at me when I found her eyes, and there was something in the angle of her antenna that I could not translate, but that felt in a way I had no scientific basis for, like curiosity, genuine, unperformed curiosity. You are Marcus Hale, she said. My translator rendered her voice as clean and even without inflection because it was not yet trained on her individual vocal patterns. It would get better at that. The human technician survey caste. That's right, I said. You covered the broodlings with your body. Yes, you did not calculate survivability outcomes. It was not a question. I answered it anyway. No, I didn't calculate anything. Her antenna shifted, both of them in the same direction, which the translator flagged as a notation of significance. This has been confirmed. Your physiological data from the moment preceding the event shows no delay interval consistent with calculated decision-making. The action was immediate. I was not sure what to say to that, so I said nothing. Do you understand what you did? She asked. I covered the broodlings, I said. I kept them from being hurt. You performed the Calvathos, she said. The brood shield rite. In our civilization, this rite is performed exclusively by members of the Queen's bonded guard, caste sworn to protect the Queen's body and lineage above their own survival. The rite has never been performed by a being outside Velkai biology. It has never been performed by a being that was not born into the bonded caste, and it has never been performed without intent. She paused. You performed it without intent. You performed it without training. You performed it without a biological drive compelling you toward it. The chamber was very quiet. The slow pulse of the bioluminescent walls moved like a tide. The Queen's bonded law is not flexible, the interpreter continued. It is not a tradition that can be set aside for diplomatic convenience. When the Kelvathos is performed, the one who performs it becomes part of the Queen's household. This is not a symbolic position. It carries binding obligations. In both directions, the Queen is bound to the one who performs it as surely as that one is bound to the Queen. I heard what she was saying. I let it sit for a moment before I responded. I'm a survey technician from Earth. I was on a supervised tour. Yes, I don't think I can be part of a Queen's household. Nonetheless, she said, and the word landed with the quiet finality of a door closing. You are. I looked past her at the Queen, who had not moved and had not spoken, and who was watching me with 6 flat luminous eyes that carried something I could not name, not malice, not warmth either, exactly something that existed in the space between those two things and had no human equivalent. Is she going to let me leave? I asked. The interpreter was still for a moment. Then her antenna moved in a way the translator flagged as requiring contextual interpretation, followed a second later by an output consideration being given. The question of release belongs to the Queen, the interpreter said. It will not be decided today. I looked around the chamber slowly at the rings of still watching Velkai, at the carved walls, at the dais, and the ancient being occupying it, at the interpreter who was watching me with that angle of antenna that felt like a question. What are the broodlings I covered? I asked specifically. Stillness lasted 3 full seconds before she answered. They are Queencast broodlings, she said. The next generation of queens. There are no others like them alive on Velcathos. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. I had covered the heirs to an alien civilization with my body because the ceiling was falling, and they were small, and I did not think about it. And now I was standing in the Queen's own chamber, bleeding on the floor, bound by a 3,000-year-old right to a civilization. I had been on the planet for 11 days. I thought about Claire and her emergency comm. I thought about the mission brief with its 3 repeated words: hierarchical, territorial, unpredictable. I thought about the carving in the tunnel wall, the bilateral figure with its arms stretched over the small oval shapes, and I wondered how long that space in the stone had been left open, whether it had always been there waiting. The Queen moved for the first time. It was a small movement. One of her upper limbs extended slightly outward and then returned, but every Velkai in the chamber responded to it immediately. The rings of observers shifted, not departing but settling into a new configuration, and 3 warriors moved to positions flanking me that were unmistakably attentive without being aggressive. The interpreter turned to me. One final time. You will be given chambers, she said. You will be given food prepared for human biology. You will not be harmed. You will not be restrained. A pause. You will not be released until the Queen releases you. When will that be? I asked. Interpreter's antenna held their angle for a long time. When it is time, she said, I was taken to my chambers by two of the flanking warriors. The chambers were deep in the complex, lit by the same bioluminescent growth, warm and quiet. There was a sleeping platform that had been clearly constructed for human proportions, measured, deliberate, prepared in advance on a low surface. Near the wall there was food, synthesized and arranged in containers that opened with simple mechanisms, and the smell of it was almost right, close enough. I sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and looked at the food for a long time without touching it. Someone had prepared this before they brought me here, before the tremor, before the tour, before I covered the broodlings and the warriors' boat. I did not know what to do with that. I filed it in the part of my mind where I was keeping things I did not yet have enough information to process, and I reached for the food and I ate, and I tried to figure out what kind of person I was going to need to be now that the person I had been before was no longer what the situation required. Outside my chambers, I could hear the deep, resonant tone from the walls, still going slow and steady like a heartbeat. I did not sleep well that first night, but I did sleep, which, given everything I considered a reasonable result. Weeks passed, then more weeks. At some point, I stopped counting the days in terms of how many had gone by since I arrived, and started counting them differently by what I learned and what I was beginning to understand. The interpreter's name by Velkai custom was not a name at all. It was a function designation, high tier. Interpreter, second household rank. Direct voice to the queen. In the Velkai system, drones and workers did not carry individual names. You were what you did. You were your caste and your rank and your function. The idea of a personal name, something given to a single individual that no one else shared, something that meant you specifically, and no one else, was not something the Velkai language had developed a native framework for, because the society had never needed one. I gave her a name. Anyway, I did it on what I had come to think of as a Tuesday, though the Velko's day cycle was about 4 hours longer than an Earth day, so the designation was approximate at best. She had spent 2 hours with me going over a set of acoustic records from the nursery tunnel, trying to help me understand what the resonance tone meant and why the warriors had responded to it the way they had. At some point in the middle of the session, she made a sound, a very small one, a brief harmonic change in the bass frequency she maintained while at rest, and my translator flagged it as something like a private observation, directed inward rather than outward, not intended to be heard. What was that? I asked, her antenna angled toward me. Self-correction, an internal notation. You make notes to yourself. All thinking beings make notes to themselves. The other interpreters I've seen don't make that sound. I said. She was still for a moment. No, they do not. Why do you? The stillness this time lasted longer. I had learned by then to read the quality of her stillness, the difference between a pause that was processing time and a pause that was something else. This one was the second kind. I observe things that I do not always have a function appropriate channel to express, she said. Finally, the notation is a private accommodation. I looked at her for a long time. She was the most self-aware being I had encountered in this compound, possibly the most self-aware non-human being I had ever met, and she had spent her entire existence being referred to as a function rather than a Person, I'd like to call you something. I said if that's acceptable, her antenna shifted in the way I had come to associate with alertness. I have function designation. I know I'd like to use something personal, something that's yours. The silence after that was different from any silence I had heard from her before. It was not processing time, it was not consideration, it was something that my translator, when it finally caught up, flagged in its imprecise and somewhat chaotic way as overwhelming scene real. She did not move. For 4 full seconds, I counted them. Sarah, I said, I'd like to call you Sarah if that works for you. When she came back to motion, the change was subtle, a fractional shift in her posture, a change in the bass frequency of her resting tone. Both things small enough that I might have missed them a month earlier. I did not miss them now. Sarah, she said, she was testing the sound of it, the way you test the weight of something before you decide whether to pick it up and carry it. You don't have to use it. I said no. She said I will use it, and then after a pause, no one has given me a thing before. I did not know what to say to that, so I said, well, now they have, and we went back to the acoustic records, and neither of us mentioned it again that day. But from that point forward, every time she entered a room and made that small private notation sound, I understood it differently. It was not a self-correction. It was the sound of a person becoming more certain of themselves. The broodlings complicated everything. The queen cast broodlings I had covered in the tunnel were growing. Queen cast development was faster than the standard Velkai cycle. They went from larval state to pre-emergence in what amounted to a few months rather than the year-long process of the worker and warrior castes. By the time I had been in the compound for 6 weeks, they were mobile, alert, and dramatically different from the soft, pale creatures I had landed on in the tunnel. They had developed the beginnings of carapace plating. Their movements were more purposeful. Their compound eyes had matured to a complex, faceted structure that caught light in every direction at once. They had also imprinted on my scent. This was not supposed to be possible. Velkai broodlings imprinted on the chemical signatures of their caste environment. Queen cast broodlings specifically imprinted on the queen's pheromone matrix, a complex chemical language that bound them to the queen's household in a way that was fundamentally biological, not chosen. It was not trust, it was not recognition. It was chemistry, deterministic and immutable, except that when I walked through the nursery passages now, they came to me, all 6 of them moving with a purpose that was unmistakable. They pressed their developing antenna against my hands, my forearms, the back of my neck. When I crouched down to their level, they made sounds that Sarah spent 3 days trying to categorize before admitting that her reference database did not have a clean match for them. They are not exhibiting imprinting behavior, she told me finally. Imprinting is passive. It is a chemical absorption process. What they are doing is active. They are seeking you out. They are initiating contact. Is that unusual? I asked, though I already knew the answer. There is no record of it, she said, in any generation for any caste. A pause. With that quality I now recognized as something personal. They are choosing to come to you. Warriors were profoundly unsettled by this. I could read it in them by then. The flattened wing position, the specific antenna angle that indicated something between alarm and confusion. They followed protocol, they did not interfere with what was happening. But every time I crouched in the nursery corridor and 6 future queens pressed themselves against me like they were verifying I was still present, I could see the warriors processing it in real time, filing it somewhere there. Operational frameworks did not have a clean category for the queen watched through observers in the nursery tunnel. I knew this because Sarah told me one afternoon with that specific stillness. That meant she was sharing something she had considered carefully before deciding to share. She watches every session. Sarah said, "Why?" I asked. "Because you are doing something that has not been done," Sarah said, "and she wants to understand what it is." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about a being who had not left her chamber in 200 years, watching through the eyes of others as something she had no category for, unfolded in her own tunnels. Does she have any conclusions yet? I asked. Not yet, Sarah said, but she is forming one. The human diplomatic team made contact 3 times during those weeks. Claire's first message was precise and controlled, which meant she was managing panic professionally. The second message was from Director Akefer back at the regional command post, and it was longer and more formal and carried the particular cadence of official language being used to cover for the fact that no one at the command post had a protocol for the situation. The third message was a request, phrased diplomatically but unmistakably, a request to speak with me directly. The Queen permitted it. I spoke with Director Akefer through relay set up by Sarah in one of the chamber's outer rooms. Akefer was a tall, direct woman who had run the regional office for 9 years and who did not use more words than a situation required. She looked at me through the comm screen for a long moment before she spoke. "Are you well?" she asked. "My back is healing," I said. "My shoulder is mostly healed. I'm being fed, given space, and treated with what I can only describe as careful respect." "Are you being held against your will?" I thought about that question more carefully than the question probably expected. "I'm being held," I said. "Against my will is more complicated, Marcus," she said, and the shift to my first name was deliberate. Softening of the official register. "We want you home. We are working on negotiating your release." "I know," I said. "Claire told me in her first message. The Velkai have not responded to any formal request." "I know that too." Akefer looked at me steadily. She was reading something in my face that she was not yet willing to say out loud. "Is there anything you can tell me that would help our position?" I looked at the wall of the outer chamber, at the slow pulse of the bioluminescent growth, at the carved records that ran unbroken from floor to ceiling. "Not yet," I said. "Honestly, but I'm learning things that I think are going to matter. I just don't know how to put them in report language." Yet she held my gaze. "You have 14 days before the situation escalates to a formal diplomatic incident." 14 days, I said. 14 days, she confirmed. After the call ended, I sat in the outer chamber for a long time. One of the broodlings had followed me in. It had developed a habit of doing that, trailing me through the complex with patient persistence. And it was sitting near my feet, antennae moving in slow exploratory patterns. I looked at it. It looked at me with compound eyes that caught every photon in the room at once and gave nothing away in conventional terms. 14 days, I said it's as Annie tapped against the floor once, my translator gave me. Nothing for that, I went back to my session notes and kept working. 14 days came and went. So did 7 more after them. The situation escalated to a formal diplomatic incident on schedule, which meant a larger human delegation arrived on Velcos and began formal proceedings that the Velkai received. With polite, unhurried silence, I was informed of this by Sarah, who had been informed by the Queen, which was how most of my information about the outside world arrived, through a chain of communication that was measured and deliberate, and that I had come to understand the Queen controlled not as a form of manipulation, but as a matter of absolute cultural logic. Information in the Vi world moved through hierarchy. That was not a feature of the system, it was the system. The Queen summoned me directly for the first time on a morning when the bioluminescent growth on my chamber walls was pulsing more slowly than usual, which Sarah had told me meant a barometric shift in the tunnel system, whether in the geological sense, deep changes in air pressure that the compound breathed in and out like a living thing. I walked to the chamber with 2 warriors at my back, which was my standard configuration by then. I had stopped thinking about the warriors in terms of whether they were restraining me and started thinking of them as a context, the way you might think of an interpreter walking beside you in a foreign city, present, aware of things. You were not useful. The chamber was different this time. The rings of observers were smaller, the space less formally occupied. Sarah was present, positioned to the Queen's right, and the Queen herself was changed in some way. Could not immediately name. The same luminous carapace, the same ancient, unhurried presence, but something in the angle of her posture was different. Something that read in the body language categories I had been studying for weeks. As intent, not ceremony, not formal business, a conversation. She spoke first before Sarah could take position. Interpreter, she spoke slowly with effort in a language that was not hers. Broken in its grammar, uneven in its rhythm, but unmistakable. Marcus Hale, she said in English, you did not calculate, you chose. The words exanded in the quiet chamber with the specific weight of something that had been held for a long time before being set down. I looked at her for a moment, at the 6 flat, luminous eyes, at the posture that meant intent, at the being who had spent, I would learn later, 4 months learning my language in private, alone, with no teacher, because she wanted to ask me a single question in my own words. Yes, I said. I chose her. Antenna moved in a way I had not seen before, and Sarah, standing very still, made the small personal notation sound that I had only ever heard her make privately. Why? The Queen asked. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered, not because I did not know the answer, because I wanted to give her the true one, not the easy one. They were small, I said. Finally, and the ceiling was large, and someone needed to be in between. I paused. That is the whole answer. There is not more to it. The Queen was still. For a long time after that, the pulse of the chamber walls moved through 3 full cycles. When she finally moved, it was to extend one of her upper limbs, not toward me but to Sarah. What passed between them in the next few seconds was too fast and too complex for my translator to follow in real time. Sarah processed it, and when she turned to me, her antennae were doing something I had never seen before. Both elevated, both angled inward, which she had once told me in a different context was the veli, physical expression of receiving. Something significant, she wants you to know something, Sarah said, and she wants to tell you herself. It will take time. Her command of your language is still developing. I have time, I said. The Queen looked at me, whatever she was about to say. She had clearly been thinking it about for longer than they language since. She assembled the words carefully, the way you assemble something delicate in my civilization. She said slowly, we do not choose. Assigned from emergence, caste function. Loyalty, chemistry decides, biology decides. I decide because my biology gives me the authority to decide. A long pause, but I do not choose what I am. I am what I am born to be. All of us are. I waited. You are not born to be anything to us, she continued. No chemistry, no caste, no assignment, and you covered my young anyway. Another pause. I have thought about this for many weeks. I cannot find in 3,000 years of our records a comparison. She paused, again building towards something. You did not have to, and you did. Silence after that was complete. What you carry, the Queen said more slowly, now choosing each word like she was placing objects on a surface with care, is something we do not have a name for. The capacity to act for something that gives you nothing return, not biology. Just she stopped, searched, choice. Yes, I said quietly, the younger. Changing, she said, you know this, I know they come to me, I said. Sarah told me it shouldn't be possible, it should not, the Queen said. They are Queen caste. Their loyalty is biological. It is assigned by chemistry as mine is, as every Velka is. She looked at me with all 6 eyes, and I felt the full weight of it. They are choosing for the first time in the history of this caste. They are choosing. They are too young to have preferences, too young to have decisions, and they are choosing. The chamber's low pulse moved through the walls. I believe, the Queen said carefully, that you are teaching them something, not in words, not in training, in presence, in the fact that you are a being who acts from choice, and they are learning that this is possible. I sat with that for a long time. The broodlings who had crept in behind me, because of course they had pressed against my legs in the particular patient way, they had developed antennae, moving slowly. What does that mean for them, I asked, if they emerge as queens who choose rather than queens who are assigned? The question sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. I do not know, the Queen said. No one knows. It has not happened before. She paused, but I think it may be the most important thing that has happened in this civilization in 3,000 years. I looked at her, at the being who had not left this chamber in 2 centuries, who had learned English in secret, alone in the dark of a room no one else entered, because she needed to ask a survey technician from Earth a single question in his own language. You could still let me go, I said. I'm not saying you should, I'm saying you could. Yes, she said. I could, but you're not going to. Not yet, she agreed, because of the broodlings, because of what the broodlings are becoming, she said, and because I do not yet know how to ensure they continue becoming it without the thing that is causing it. I looked down at the 6 future queens pressed against my legs. You think if I leave they stop choosing? I said. I think, the Queen said carefully, that I am not willing to find out. Director Akifer arrived on Velkathos herself on a morning when they Tunnel air was cold and the bioluminescent growth on the walls was bright in that particular way that meant a pressure front had moved through. She came with a team of 4, all of them in diplomatic gray, all of them composed in the careful, controlled manner of people who had been briefed extensively and were managing the gap between their briefing and reality. Sarah met them at the transit station and brought them to the outer meeting chamber. I was already there. I stood up when Akefer entered, and she stopped for a moment, reading me the way she had through the comm screen, looking for the thing behind surface. You look different, she said. I've been here. While I said, she sat down across from me at the low table the Velkai had furnished for the meeting. Her team took positions flanking her. I sat alone, though the 2 warriors at the chamber entrance were technically present, and the broodlings had gathered outside the chamber door in a patient cluster that was visible through the gap, which I could tell was making Akefer's team profoundly uncomfortable. The formal diplomatic record will say this, Akefer said, cutting directly to it the way she always did. Earth requests the voluntary release of Marcus Hale, a civilian survey technician currently held in the Velkai Royal Complex under terms of an ancient cultural obligation that was enacted without his prior knowledge or consent. This is a formal request. No, I said. I drafted my own response to that request. Would you like to hear it? Akefer and LT Unk and GT's expression did not change, but something behind her eyes shifted. Go ahead. I had been thinking about this for 3 days, about how to put into official language the things I had learned, the things the Queen had told me, the things Sarah had shown me in the records, the things I had observed in the nursery passages. Watching future queens press themselves against a survey technician's hands with the specific, careful curiosity of beings discovering that choice was a thing that existed. The cultural obligation that binds me here is not a negotiating position. I said the Queen is not leveraging it. She is not extracting anything from it. She is not making demands in exchange for releasing me. She is honoring a law her civilization has held for 3,000 years. And that law exists not to trap people, but to ensure that those who have demonstrated the capacity to guard something precious are treated as precious in return. That's a generous interpretation, Akefer said carefully. It's an accurate one, I said. Director, I need to tell you something that is not in any of my filed reports, because I did not know how to put it in report language until recently. I looked at her steadily. Something is happening here that has never happened before in Velkai history. The next generation of queens, the broodlings I covered in that tunnel, are exhibiting voluntary behavioral patterns that should not be biologically possible at their developmental stage. They are choosing, and the leading hypothesis which the Queen herself has communicated to me is that my presence, not my actions, not anything I've done deliberately, just the fact of being a being who acted from choice, is the catalyst. Akefer was quiet for a moment. If the next generation of Velkai queens are capable of chosen loyalty, I said, rather than assigned biologically determined loyalty, do you understand what that means for every future diplomatic relationship between Earth and the Velkai, for every species that has tried and failed to negotiate with them for generations? The entire structure of their civilization is based on a premise that choice is not possible. If that changes, if they have Queens who can choose who they trust, who they ally with, what they believe. That is not a political development. That is a civilizational one. I let that sit. You're asking me to accept that a survey technician falling on some larve has potentially altered the trajectory of an alien civilization, Akapor said. I'm asking you to consider that human nature, the specific irrational, biologically unjustified tendency we have to cover things smaller than us. When the ceiling falls might be the most significant thing we've ever exported off our planet. Akapor looked at me for a long time. Her team was very still. You want to stay, she said. I want to be honest about what's at stake. If I leave before this is finished, I said, the Queen will let you choose. She already did, I said. She told me I could leave. She told me she would not stop me. She's holding me by law, and she is also underneath that holding me by a question she has not finished asking, and I think the most important thing I can do right now is not leave until she has the answer. Akapor looked at me for a long time, then she looked at the chamber door where 6 future queens were clustered in the gap, patient and luminous. 14 more days, she said. I can hold off the formal escalation for 14 more days. After that, my hands are tied. I'll know what I need to know by then, I said, and I believed it. She left with her team, and I sat in the empty chamber for a while. The broodlings drifted in through the gap in the door one by one and settled around me in the unhurried way they had developed, and I sat with them and thought about choice, the weight of it, the cost of it, the strange and specific grace of it. Sarah came in after some time and sat with the quiet ease she had developed over weeks of shared sessions. Her antenna held the angle that meant she was comfortable. You spoke well, she said. I spoke honestly, I said. I don't know if it was well, though. There's the same thing, she said, more often than people believe. I looked at her at the marking she carried that designated her as a function rather than a person in a civilization that had never had a word for what she actually was. At the 4C second on silence she had held the day, I gave her a name. Sarah, I said. What do you think is going to happen? She considered this for a long moment in the way she considered things that mattered, fully, carefully, with no performance of certainty she did not feel. I think she said that something is about to change, and I think it will be the kind of change that looks small from the outside and is enormous from the inside. Pause. The best changes usually are outside the tunnel walls pulsed with their slow, steady light. The broodlings breathed beside me in the warm, humid air, and somewhere deeper in the compound, ancient and luminous and thinking in ways that had no human equivalent, the Queen waited to see what the next 14 days would bring. The emergence began on the 11th day. I was in the nursery passage doing something I had taken to doing every morning, simply walking slowly through the warm, humid tunnels and talking, not teaching, not directing, just talking, telling the broodlings about things, the taste of rain, the way cities sound at 3 in the morning, the geometry of a leaf, the particular way that very old dogs look at you when they are deciding whether you are worth getting up for. I had no evidence that they understood the words. I had significant evidence that they understood something else. The presence of a voice with intention behind it, the sound of a mind engaged with the world. On the 11th day, the largest of the 6 stopped moving in the middle of the passage. I stopped talking. I had started using gendered pronouns for the queen cast broodlings because it seemed appropriate and the language needed. Something stood completely still for a moment that stretched past comfort into something else. Her antenna, usually mobile and investigative, went flat, her partially developed carapace amber over white, in the complex pattern of the queen cast began to emit a very faint light at its edges. I went to get Sarah. What followed was something I can only describe by the shape of it, because I do not have the biological vocabulary to describe the content. Emergence in the queen cast was, according to every Velkai record and every observation in the mission brief, a process that lasted between 3 and 5 days, and during which the brooding underwent a metamorphic transition into adult form. The process was organic and autonomous and irreversible. Once begun, it could not be stopped and could not be assisted. The Velkai understanding of emergence was that it was entirely internal, private biological event that the surrounding world could not touch. 3 days in, the third broodling began to show instability signs. Sarah recognized them before I did: a tremor in the carapace, a disruption in the edge light that should have been steady and was instead flickering. She described it in terms I partially followed. The metamorphic chemistry was not integrating correctly, a rare condition in the historical record. When this occurred, the emergence ended in loss. There was no intervention, there was no treatment. The Velkai understanding was that it was a natural process, and natural processes contain natural failures. I sat beside her for 4 hours that night, talking about nothing specific, about everything I could think of, about the way sound behaves in a large empty space, about the names humans give to stars and why we named them at all, about what courage feels like from the inside, which is nothing like what it looks like from the outside. It feels like moving before you have decided to move, like your hands knowing something your brain has not yet been told. I was not doing anything medically useful. I was not applying treatment. I was not fixing anything. I was being present in the specific way. That presence sometimes is the only thing available, and turns out to be enough. At the end of the 4th hour, the flickering stabilized. By the morning of the 4th day, the light at her carapace edges was steady. She emerged on the 5th day, and she was whole. Sarah stood beside me when it happened and made the private notation sound, and this time she did not try to explain it or walk it back, and I did not ask her to. The queen summoned me that evening. The chamber was full in a way it had not been before. Not the concentric rings of silent observers I had seen at my first meeting, but a more complex arrangement, layered and dense, that Sarah told me quietly represented the full active household, every caste, every tier, all present. The queen had not moved from her days. The newly emerged broodlings, all 6 of them now, because the others had completed emergence in the days following, were in the chamber, arranged in a loose group. Near the day, they were different though. Same presence as I had known, but expanded into their full forms, armored and luminous with the specific quality of young queens that no briefing document had adequately captured. Presence that was somehow both ancient and entirely new. When I entered, all 6 of them turned to me. Sarah was walking slightly ahead of me toward her formal position, and she stopped for a moment when the 6 new queens turned. I had learned to read her well enough by Then to see that the pause was not professional, it was personal. The queen raised one upper limb, the same small gesture I had seen her make months ago. That moved everyone in the room, and the chamber went entirely still. She spoke in English. She had been practicing. Her command of the language had grown considerably over months of private work, and what had been halting and searching in our first real conversation was now measured and deliberate, still accented by the physical architecture of a being designed for an entirely different kind of speech, but clear, precise. "Marcus Hale," she said, "you came to Velocathos. As a technician, you entered our nursery. As an observer, you performed our most sacred rite without knowledge of it, without training for it, and without the biology that we believed was required. For it, a pause, you sat with a dying young one through the night and gave her the only thing that could not be synthesized or prescribed or commanded. Another pause, you gave her the knowledge that she was not alone." The chamber held its stillness. The bioluminescent walls pulsed once slowly. "Under the Kelvathos bonded law," the queen continued, "you have been a member of my household. This status carries obligations on both sides. I have kept mine, you have kept yours, and more than yours, in ways that the law did not require and that you gave freely." She looked at me with all six eyes, and I held the weight of it without looking away. "I am performing the release rite. You are no longer bound to my household by obligation." The chamber seemed to breathe around me. The gathered veli shifted in a wave, not discomfort, but the specific collective response to a significant event that I had learned to recognize. Over months, Sarah began the formal components of the rite, speaking in Velkai, her voice clear and measured. I stood still through it and let it complete, and when it was done, there was a silence that felt different from all the other silences I had stood in during my time here. Not empty, full. The kind of silence that happens when something that has been unfinished becomes finished. Then the queen did something that Sarah had not told me to expect. She lowered herself from the dais, moving slowly with a particular gravity of a being that did not hurry because it did not need to. She came to a stop in front of me, close enough that I could see the individual plates of her ancient carapace, the light that moved beneath them, the six eyes that had watched me for months from a distance and were watching me now from 2 m away. And she bowed, not a partial dip, not a formal inclination, a full bow, her upper body lowering, her front limbs extending to either side, her head dropping until her mandibles nearly touched to the floor. In front of every veli in the room, in front of every caste and tier of her household, a queen, to a single human in the full formal posture of profound acknowledgement. She held it for 3 seconds. When she rose, I was not sure I was breathing. One of her upper limbs moved toward me slowly, giving me time to understand and accept it, and the tip of her foremost appendage touched my forehead with a pressure that was light enough to be a question. I did not move away. After a moment, she withdrew her limb and returned to the dais, and the chamber began to breathe again around me. Sarah was standing a few meters to my right. She was weeping. I had not known they could weep. The moisture at her compound eyes caught the bioluminescent light in bright points, and she was making no effort to conceal it, which I knew by then was something significant in Velkai behavioral terms, not performing emotion but letting it be present. "Sarah," I said quietly, Yes, she said, and her voice carried the notation. Sound woven through it, not as a correction anymore, but as a signature. What did the gesture mean? When she touched my forehead, Sarah was quiet for a moment. The notation sound held steady. It is very old, she said. Finally, older than the formal records. It is given only in the most significant of circumstances, and only by the Queen, and only when she wishes to convey something for which there is no right and no procedure. She paused. The closest rendering in your language would be, you are no longer ours, but we are yours by choice. The 6 young queens moved toward me in the slow, investigative way I had known them through their entire development, but different now. They were full and luminous and ancient new, and when they pressed their antenna against my hands, I felt not the curiosity of growing things, but the certainty of beings that had made a decision. I stood in the middle of a chamber full of alien life, and let them make contact in thought about choice, about the specific, irrational human tendency to act before thinking when something smaller than you is in danger, and about all the places that tendency might lead if you followed it far enough. It had led me here to a name given in a tunnel, to 4 hours of talking through the night, to a bow from the most ancient living authority on a world I had arrived on as a stranger. I went back to human space the following morning. The formal handover was efficient. Claire met me at the transit station with a look that carried about 7 months of worry in it, and she didn't say anything for the first few minutes, which was exactly right. Akefer's office processed my return documentation and began the debrief scheduling. I was given 2 days to exist before the official session started. I spent those 2 days writing, not the formal reports. Those could wait. I wrote the things that do not go into reports, about what it felt like to give someone a name and watch them hold it, about the specific sound of a civilization encountering something it had no category for, about what choice looks like from the outside of the species that invented it, foreign and strange, and somehow, against all biological probability, contagious. On the morning of the 3rd day, Director Akefer's office sent a message, formal brief, the kind of language that carries a significant thing inside a small container. The Velkai had requested a permanent human present, the royal complex, not an observation team, not a diplomatic rotation, a permanent individual representative with direct household access, answering to both the Queen's Court and the human diplomatic corps. The position had no prior template, no training program existed for it. No one in the history of human Valky contact had ever been in a position fill it. The message asked if I would be willing to be considered. I was still holding my coffee when I read it, still looking at the gray morning light coming through the transit station window, still thinking in the background of everything else about a sound Sarah made when no one was supposed to hear her, a small private notation, the sound of a person discovering that they were one. I opened a reply, typed yes. I sent it before I finished the coffee. People ask me sometimes when they hear the outline of the story whether I was scared under that collapsing ceiling, whether I had a moment of terrible bravery, a conscious decision to be the person who ran toward instead of away. I tell them the truth, which is that I do not remember being scared. I remember the ceiling moving. I remember the broodlings being small. I remember that Someone needed to be in between them and the thing that was falling, and I was standing in the right place at the right time, and then I was moving, and then it was done. That is the whole story. Survey technician, a falling ceiling. Reflex that humans have been carrying around for so long we have forgotten. It is remarkable. We cover things smaller than us. We do it without thinking. We do it before the cost has been calculated. We do it because it is the obvious thing to do, the only thing in the half second before the brain catches up with the hands. Turns out that in a universe full of species built on biology and chemistry and caste and assignment, a creature that acts without being assigned to act is the strangest and most interesting thing there is. Turns out that instinct, if it is the right kind, looks an awful lot like a miracle from the outside. I packed my bag that morning and booked transit back to Velcathos. I had a civilization to get back